Listen, when you have a party in a two-party system that's slated to win back some seats in the midterm elections, and that party has an approval rating of 40%, you really have a serious problem. It's always been a joke that you're always voting for the lesser of two evils, and now that joke is a reality. After Trump won in 2024, James Carville said, just sit back and let it happen. Wait for him to fail. Just let it get so bad that the voters don't have any other choice but to vote for us. That's the winning idea. That's the winning strategy right now. No time for any kind of self-reflection or trying to understand why the voters rejected you. Just wait for things to get so miserable that we start to look good. So in 2016, Democrats were faced with the stark reality that the voters rejected them. They do a postmortem on the campaign, try to figure out what went wrong. They do this autopsy, this post-action report, and what do? They refuse to release it. Why doesn't it come out? For reasons. That's it. So this rumination is going to be on Ken Martin and the DNC. This guy is fucking Jerry Lundegaard from Fargo, and I think he's going to follow a similar character arc. Now, part of his job is to try to figure out what went wrong in the 2024 election. He came in, said that they were going to do an autopsy and get to the bottom of things. They're going to ask everybody what went wrong, how it went wrong, and what we can do better to change everything. He criticized the fact that they didn't release the 2016 report, and he said that he was going to do better. Now, the problem with the Democratic Party is something that is a mystery to the leadership. But to about 80% of the country, it's not a mystery at all. This isn't a fucking mystery. Who's missing this? Who's not understanding this? I mean, 80% of the country has a pretty good understanding of what went wrong. Unfortunately, it's the 20% of the country that's basically running the party and calling the shots. These are the same people who realized they had a massive problem among young male voters, and they decided to have an outreach position to get their finger on the pulse of what some term the Joe Rogan voting bloc. At least I think that's what they call it. Joe Rogan seems to be some sort of abstract concept to these people. No one seems to know what's going on at that podcast, and for some reason, nobody's taken the time to try to figure it out. They started referring to him as a far-right or alt-right leader in 2021, 22, and this is after he endorsed Bernie Sanders in 2020. But anyway, to really get an idea of what's going on with the young men around the country and get a feeling of what's important to them, they designate this young male outreach position and select this young lady here. This is Olivia Giuliana, whose bio from the National Union of Healthcare Workers states she identifies as a queer, plus-size, disabled Latina. I'm just saying that's not probably the choice I would have made. I imagine someone in the top brass was like, buy me a guy, and after some nervous, uncertain, darting looks around the room, someone runs out of the room and brings her back. And then after a long, awkward silence, she says, don't worry, I'm Latinx. And then there's a collective sigh of relief, and they all start to have a good laugh. So the same people who made that decision are the same people who are trying to get their hands around what went wrong in 2024. So last August, Ken Martin goes on the Pod Save America podcast and gives this whole spiel about how he's going to change the party, and they're going to figure out what went wrong, and we're going to do better next time. So now take a look at this.
Save America.
Thank you, John. It's my second time, right?
This is your second time, first time in person.
That's great.
We love that. So it's been 6 months. Have you fixed the party yet?
Working on it for sure. And I've been hard at work in these 6 months. Lots of great programs we've started, initiatives that we're doing, fundraising is going great. There's lots of stuff that's happening, of course. It's going to take some time, right, for sure. You look at Mamdani in New York and what he did there, right? You know, I think it's both authenticity matters, clearly authenticity matters. You know, you can't get up and say one thing and do another. And that's part of the challenge for the Democratic Party, as we've talked about before, is people just don't believe that we're standing up and fighting for them. So authenticity, people thirst for that in politics, but that's not enough alone, right?
Holy shit, if that's not saying the quiet part out loud. Apparently, this is a revelation. It's something that had to be said, something that they weren't taking into account previously. But okay, you got to start somewhere. I'll give him that.
But I would say most importantly, what he campaigned on, he campaigned for something. Think about that. He had a very positive message about how he was actually going to make things more affordable for people, how he's going to actually make it easier for people to live in New York City. And so
think about that. He campaigned on something. Isn't that crazy? I think we should just kind of stop here and let Ken sit there and let that sink in a little bit. Apparently having ideas and talking about how you're going to accomplish those ideas is a new step. It's something new we're going to try.
That I think really attracted people to his candidacy was people could remember what some of his big policy proposals were, whether or not you agreed with them.
Yeah, I think we should, to be honest with you. I think people want a sense of what you're actually going to do. And, you know, it can't just be platitudes. I think the more detail we can give to the American people, the better.
So now, do I think giving people an idea of what you want to do and how you want to do it is a good idea? I think that's a step in the right direction. I think that might help things. I mean, actually have something to run on. I don't want to be rude here. And I have to admit that it's probably a small section of the population that actually votes on issues and not just reflexively for their team. But when we've gotten to the point where one of the two major parties is just coming to the conclusion now that they should have an agenda, that they should have a platform, that they should have ideas and illustrate to the voters of how they're going to accomplish those ideas. When they're just coming to that conclusion now, I think they're pretty far behind and they're pretty far off course. But let's see what else he has to say.
And part of that is actually running on a tangible agenda that people can see and they know what they're voting for. And that I think, again, you mentioned Mamdani, there's plenty of people who are running on very, specific policy agenda, giving people specifics about what they would do if they were elected. And that's what I think our party and our leadership needs.
Oh, wow. A tangible agenda that people can see what they're voting for. Now, this seems to be an idea that he keeps kind of dancing around, but he just can't get his hands around it. And you're going to see that this is a common thread that keeps being repeated over and over again and kind of approached at weird angles instead of taken directly head on. Now, I understand that, again, there are people out there who don't see any problem with this. They just see that person's a Democrat. You vote for that person. Doesn't matter what the hell they're talking about. They have no ideas. That's all right. I'm a Democrat. I vote for Democrats.
About ways to, show that the Democratic Party regains trust with people, that people think that, Democrats are honest brokers and, there's no secret backroom dealing. Yeah. And just because, obviously trust in institutions everywhere is at an all-time low, that includes the Democratic Party. What sort of reforms or changes have you had in mind for the party, with what you can control that would help people, build trust in the party again?
Yeah. I mean, as you know, I famously know now, I brought the superdelegate reform forward in 2017 because I saw in 2016, whether real or perceived, there were supporters of a presidential candidate that year who felt like party bosses were putting their thumb on the scale, of course, and that the establishment was pushing them and their candidate out of the process. If we want to actually attract people back into the party, we have to make sure that our party is not, in fact, putting its thumb on the scale. And so that neutrality pledge was really important for me then, and it continues to be now. And so I'm bringing a whole slew of reforms forward to actually help democratize the DNC itself.
Getting people to see the Democrats as honest brokers. Democracy is a good thing. Democratizing the DNC, that's a novel idea. I kind of like where his head's at with this. I mean, again, I think they should have been there to begin with, but it's never too late, like I said. Now, there's a small contingent, myself included, whose main thesis is basically that the Democrats sold out working class and middle class people and shifted focus to the professional managerial class. And these people have kind of shifted into power positions within the Democratic Party. They get further and further away from the real economy and where money is created. And then it becomes this abstract concept, this idea to them. It's just numbers on a check that come in the mail or show up in a bank account. So a lot of times with these people, when you talk about ideas around the economy and how to get the economy going and how to figure out wealth distribution and wealth inequality, they kind of give you a blank stare and they just have these pre-assembled talking points that don't really have anything to do with the problem at hand. And a lot of times the solutions that they put forth are just these tired, recycled things, these talking points over and over again that they can never get past and that actually don't work. But as long as people can keep talking about that, it moves focus away from the things that can actually solve the problems, things that Democrats used to talk about. But the problem is, as your donors have shifted away from working class people and trade unions, they used to support the Democrats consistently. They were the ones pumping money into the campaigns. Now that that's been hollowed out, and unions have far less power, they have to rely on big businesses and corporations to basically give them their money and fund campaigns. And the thing is, big business interests don't really align with working class and middle class people. They're at odds with each other. Because when the middle class starts doing well, it means business has to be doing a little bit less well. And when big businesses are doing great, it usually means that the middle class and the working class and the poor are doing much worse. So this seems to me the secret elephant in the room is that they backed away from an economic populist message, a message that was put forth by Bernie Sanders. And now they have to do everything that they can to get people to stop looking that way, get people to think only about the things that they're interested in. And because of this focus on the things that they do care about, it inevitably ends to state and local massive mismanagement of these areas. You see things like increased crime, increased homelessness, fiscal strain, fiscal waste. And instead of taking a step back and saying, hey, what are we doing wrong here? Why do we seem to be failing repeatedly? They just play this shell game where they're trying to avert your attention and draw it to someplace else. But now let's jump ahead to his last appearance on Pod Save America after it came out that the report was out and that they're not going to release it.
In February of 25, you criticized the DNC's refusal to release their 2016 autopsy as exactly what not to do. You said, quote, was there any utility in doing that? And then promised your 2024 autopsy would be different. Your exact quote was, of course it will be released. Why did you change your mind on that?
Well, look, I mean, what I said all along, even when I ran for this position, is that we were going to focus on the things that will help us win the upcoming election, right? Making sure that we learn the right lessons that could help inform our victories. And that's what we've done. We said this when we sent out the press release back in November.
First off, I just want to say Ken is looking a little haggard here. He's looking like he's been through it. Possibly been wearing that suit for a few days. Maybe his wife kicked him out of the house. I don't know that for a fact. But anybody whose job is to run around and spend their day defending indefensible positions, they're going to look a little haggard. It's going to weigh on you. Now he's talking about moving forward and learning the lessons that we learned from the 2024 campaign, the lessons that presumably are in the secret report that they're not releasing. He's claiming you can't learn anything from the report. You can only learn from the lessons that have been disseminated through the people who read the report, presumably him and some other people, and they've formulated these lessons to help win in the future. Okay, sounds good.
And we weren't going to release the report. We were going to actually keep our focus on those lessons, and we release those lessons. We continue to do that. And it's important for me, instead of navel gazing and looking backwards and trying to relitigate 2024. I don't know about you, John, but I don't have a time machine. I don't think you do. No one does. So we can't change what happened in 24. The only thing we can do is actually change what happens in the future, including the 26 election cycle, 28 and beyond. That means we do need to learn the lessons. We need to make sure they help inform our decisions that we're making. And we've been releasing those. We released them just a couple months ago in our playbook, which if you want to look at that, go to dnc.org/playbook, and you can get an example.
Wait till you
of
get a
some of the
load of the
lessons.
playbook.
We've been releasing them with our donors and with activists and party leaders. We've been talking about what those lessons are, and we've actually been putting those lessons into action. And so it's not completely accurate to say that we didn't release that. Where we're keeping our focus is on the lessons that can actually help us win.
But on this show in August, you told me this about releasing the review, quote, "We have to do it to give people who invested so much time, energy, and money a sense of what happened and why we lost."
Correct.
Especially why we lost. So what changed between August and December? I understand there are lessons, but those are not the full report. Why not release the full report? What's in the report that you wouldn't want
Well, first off,
to publicize?
there's no smoking gun in the report, and I know that's what everyone's so eager to learn. The smoking gun. Guess what, John?
But if there's no smoking gun, why wouldn't you just release it then?
Because we want to keep the focus on the lessons. Because what ends up happening here is that people, of course, want to weaponize the report in a way to look backwards.
He wants to keep the report secret so that people don't focus on it and only focus on the lessons that he and presumably others have decided are the lessons to be learned. So now all anyone's focused on, of course, is the fact that the reports aren't being released. He claims that there's no smoking gun in the report. Just trust us on that, bro. Now, of course, he's right. You can't change what happened in 2024, but if you could be open and honest about what went wrong and maybe you could change those things, you could potentially shift the party into a reasonable situation where voters are more willing to vote, not based on the fact that they hate the opposition, but because they like your ideas, because they believe in your ideas. You don't have any ideas. And keeping this report secret is like saying you don't want to admit what went wrong. You don't want to admit having no ideas, or the ideas that you have are outright rejected by voters. How fucking embarrassing does this report have to be to refuse to release it? So let's throw out some ideas of what could possibly be in the report that they don't want you to be talking about. Number one, first and foremost, was probably lack of policy and agenda, which he talked about back in August. He danced around that topic like it was some revelatory thing that you should have an agenda, a roadmap of ideas and how to get there. So that's number one. Admitting that, I could see that being a little embarrassing. Number two, you ran a candidate who was not really elected and didn't go through a primary process, so she wasn't selected by the voters. Back in August, he talked about democratizing the DNC, and maybe that would be a good first step. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with admitting, hey, we really should have probably done a primary. But maybe you also have to admit that Kamala Harris was not a reasonable candidate to even be vice president. I mean, she ran in 2020 and she didn't get any delegates. She wasn't very popular. She had kind of a disastrous debate performance where she accused Joe Biden of being racist. And then she got called out by Tulsi Gabbard for a number of things, her record primarily being California Attorney General, which her record was kind of indefensible. And that's why she really didn't gain any traction in 2020. Voters rejected her back then. And Biden admitted publicly that he selected her because she was a woman and because she was not a white woman. So maybe the report indicates that she was not only an unsuitable presidential candidate, but she really didn't belong in the vice presidency either. Now, again, I think honesty is the best policy, and it would probably be a good idea to be open and honest about that, saying that, hey, selecting people based solely on their gender or race is a bad idea. But I can see, all right, now I get it. All right, so maybe that could be embarrassing. I mean, you don't want to admit that the person you ran because she was vice president and that she was selected as vice president basically as a DEI hire. Okay, so that might be a little embarrassing. And by having to reject the DEI thing and explain that was why it failed, that could be a little embarrassing. Okay, I got that. But then maybe what else could be embarrassing that you could admit to? I remember Trump had that thing about no tax for tips, and Democrats' response was, me too. I'm going to do that too. Maybe the fact that there was no solid economic policy, the idea again of taxing the rich got brought up. I think a lot of people understand that that's not really going to help them in their day-to-day lives. Most people get that by now, I think. And then I know Harris had this idea of taxing unrealized capital gains, which if you don't know, if you hold stock or even the value of your home, or they didn't get into the specifics too much, but if the value of your house or the value of your assets go up a lot, you have to pay taxes on that, even though it doesn't represent like money in your checking account that you can write a check for. Now, they said it was only going to be like the top 1% and the ultra rich, the ultra wealthy. But again, I think a lot of people are cued into the idea that when you open up a new policy that's geared only toward the rich, eventually makes its way to the middle class. And there might have been enough savvy voters to realize that that's a bad idea. Maybe you could exempt 401ks, but maybe you're just a average Joe who started investing in the stock market, 20 bucks here, 100 bucks there. And now you've got this nest egg in sort of a, a non-retirement account that if you have a great year, who knows, shit, you bought Nvidia in 2015, 100 shares when it was, what, 15 bucks? And now you got a couple $100,000 in the bank account and you got to pay taxes on that. So that was sort of a loser of a night. So let's keep going here.
But it concerns me that I see two things. One, this autopsy, which you campaigned on releasing, and I know you're releasing lessons, but are hiding still plenty of the details in the autopsy, and I just can't figure out what details that are in there that you don't want out there because you don't trust people with, because they're going to, I guess, argue about them, because it feels like we really need a robust discussion about where the party's headed, not just pundits like me, but the state party chairs and the DNC committee members who are asking you to release it. They're asking you to release it.
I know you want to keep focusing on that, and that's fine.
Well, and I'm saying, and I do think that affects and the fundraising isn't going well either. So I feel like that's
fundraising. That is just completely inaccurate, John.
I mean, you had a great first year in 2025,
and we've had a great first quarter. $32 million we raised in the first quarter. We raised $4 million in March than Tom Perez did in 2018.
That's excluding debt, though. That's excluding debt.
We have 50% more cash on hand than Tom Perez did.
But you're excluding debt. You don't have 50% more cash on hand if you include your debt.
John, we do, because at the end of the day, we can pay that debt off whenever the hell we want. I could hold that debt until the end of the year. So the reality is there's nothing that's holding me back in terms of the cash I have, the cash on hand I have to spend it on elections. I can carry that debt all the way through the end of this year and beyond if I want. So that's just inaccurate. I know you know campaigns, but you're just spewing stuff out that's just wrong. So
I'm saying that I saw that talking point about 50% more, and it's based on excluding the debt. So that's why it's not.
Now, aside from the fact that I think they need someone with accounting experience to be there guiding him, perhaps, the rest of the podcast was pretty much the same thing. Running around in circles talking about how the court has some valuable lessons and that they are disseminating them through the playbook. So maybe we should take a look at the playbook, see what that has to say. Right here, what we heard from the cohort participants: diversity of communities. Organizing under a single umbrella ignores differences between ethnic groups, languages, and political experiences. Trying to lump everyone together in one box isn't working. There's so many different ways to get to the heart of people's decision making. Now, in my experience, if you're asking for my opinion, I would say the identity politics probably hurt them. I mean, let's say you have the average black voter. They're concerned about the economy, concerned about jobs, better paying jobs. And you have one candidate who says, I want to create better jobs. And then the other candidate says, I want to listen to you because you're a black person. Now, sure, that tactic may work for some people, but if you don't see yourself exclusively at your race or your gender or your sexual orientation, and you're interested in things like making money and being safe and having a nice life, those things are probably going to take a back seat. I'm just saying, maybe, I don't know. Economic hopelessness. Young voters' political engagement is driven by an evaporating entry-level job market, the exorbitant cost of rent, crushing student debt. Young voters don't expect to do better financially than their parents. Now, the economic hopelessness thing is interesting because, as I mentioned before, the Democrats don't really seem to have a solid foundational economic plan. And the crushing student debt, Biden offered amnesty or forgiveness for the student debt loans, which isn't really fair because a lot of people paid off their student loans. So maybe the idea of how to get jobs and how to get better jobs into the country and make these jobs accessible to the country's citizens should be the top priority. Because historically, at least in the past 10 years, that's not what they've been focused on. Right now, young people with degrees in computer science and engineering and basically the IT field, they have one of the highest unemployment rates of any sector. And yet we keep bringing people in from overseas, primarily India, on H-1B visas to fill these job positions, despite the fact that you're talking about a 7 to 8% unemployment rate. So you have qualified Americans in the country who can't get these jobs. Maybe that's something Democrats might want to look into, but maybe that's another uncomfortable topic. Radar for authenticity. As social media natives, young people have a hypersensitive radar for cringe, untrustworthy content. Even when executed well, being online isn't enough to break through or inspire action. I really feel like social media is that first step, that recognition, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's who you're going to believe in. And then gender divergence. Algorithms are sorting young men and women into increasingly separate and often opposing political realities. Young men specifically targeted by a sophisticated right-wing media ecosystem that offers them explanations for their economic anxiety, social isolation, and perceived loss of status. Now, the quote that they're using says, I went to an all-girls school. I think we had one Trump supporter in our entire school, like super, super liberal school. We had a brother school, and they were like same location under the same sphere. They were really conservative, and I feel like this really sums up what's going on with Gen Z right now. So holy shit, authenticity matters. It turns out people can tell when you're full of shit and saying things that you don't actually believe in. This goes out into a larger problem because people have pointed out that Kamala Harris famously didn't go on the Joe Rogan podcast, and she limited her exposure to long-form interviews that Trump and J.D. Vance were really taking advantage of. And I've read some political commentators on the left, Democrats, who have pointed out the fact that everything they say publicly is kind of pushed through this filter that's a tightly focus group oriented, skewed lens of what the people in leadership believe are important and the right things to be saying at the time. If those are the things that are guiding what you're saying and your beliefs, sitting down for a 3-hour conversation off the cuff that's not going to be edited is not going to be your strong suit. And we've seen Gavin Newsom go on several podcasts recently and really kind of not do so well, because eventually you're going to get cornered and you're going to have to try to justify the things that you're saying, justify your beliefs and explain them. And if your beliefs are things that you were just handed in a memo that a focus group said you should care about, a highly curated focus group that might not be representative of the entire country, authenticity is going to be an uphill battle. So a Democrat should focus less on focus groups and broaden out the net, try to figure out what's really going on. But what the hell do I know? And then we talk about the gender divergence. It says young men are increasingly targeted by sophisticated right-wing media ecosystems, offering them explanations for their economic anxiety, social isolation, and perceived loss of status. Now, the problem with that is that I think by default, anybody offering men an explanation for economic outcomes or their loss in status that don't frame it as men being inherently bad, that's automatically viewed as right-wing. So that's a problem. So if the DNC and the people running the DNC, people making the decisions, have shrunk their world down to this extremely small worldview that's not representative of the world that everybody else is living in, and they can throw labels on things and label them as good or bad right off the bat, that's an issue. If someone points to the idea that your economic anxiety stems from the fact that you were told to go to college and then you choose a career where just by the fact that you're male, you might not be favored to get that position, and pointing that out correctly, statistically, with facts and studies that indicate that, well, that's going to be labeled as right-wing. The policy isn't the problem, you are the problem. If someone says that your perceived loss of social status is because from a very early age, you've been taught that all masculinity is toxic masculinity and is inherently bad, and that you are inherently bad, if somebody tells you otherwise, that person is bad. That person is right-wing. The problem isn't the policy or the way we're looking at things. The problem is with you. If we could just get people to understand that they are the problem and not us, things would work out better, and they would see that we're right and that they would vote for us, and then we would win, and then we would kind of lord over them. But how can we get people to understand that we're right and they're wrong? How can we shrink their world down to our world? So reading through the entire playbook, I've come to the conclusion that their view is that the people who didn't vote for them are living in a bubble. They're living in a bubble, and they care about things that they shouldn't be caring about, like the economy and jobs and security and safety. People can figure out and sniff out when you're being fake and trying to manipulate them. And then the playbook is about how to counteract that thing, how to get people to not care about your inauthenticity, not care about the fact that you have no ideas, how to get them to shift what they care about into the things that they're caring about, which are things that really have no factual basis in reality or will improve their lives objectively in any way, shape, or form. Now, unfortunately, what you would hope would happen is that people start to recognize this, and they start to see how they can improve people's lives through real material ways. Young men are drifting away from the party because it's a search for dignity, human dignity, that the Democratic Party isn't offering them right now. And that was a choice. It was a thought-out, calculated choice. Now, I showed you the young lady who was put in charge of the mail outreach. I think that says everything right there. Now, that was done in 2025. That was a little over a year ago. And obviously nothing came of that. She stepped down. I don't know if they did away with the position or not. But the fact that somebody thought that was a good idea to begin with is troubling, to say the least. So I would have hoped to have seen from this playbook is a little more self-reflection and understanding that they're going to have to change, and they're going to have to go back 10, 15 years to what they used to run on. Because one of their weaknesses is that whether it's good information or bad information, information is immediately accessible to everyone today. It's sitting right in your pocket. And the fact that we have this information available to us, and we can fact check things on the fly, we can do our own research pretty easily, means that the number of voters who are a little more savvy and a little more, let's say, issue-oriented is on the rise. It used to be normalcy bias would take over. I'm a Democrat, I vote for Democrats. I'm a Republican, I vote for Republicans, just reflexively. And one of the things that's been bothering me is that in 2008, if you voted for Obama, not based on Obama being a great speaker or being charismatic or for whatever superficial reason you might have voted for him, but if you voted for him based on what he wanted to do with the economy, what he wanted to do with trade, what he wanted to do with healthcare, and he had ideas and paths to get there, and you believed in those ideas and you believed in those paths and you thought that they were the correct way to go, if you were that kind of voter in 2008 who enthusiastically embraced Obama, you would definitely have problems with Hillary Clinton in 2016 because her entire campaign was devoid of any sort of economic plan. And then in 2020, the same thing. The fact that we were going through COVID and a massive pandemic gave Biden the edge. Trump probably wouldn't have lost in 2020 if it weren't for the pandemic. And then in 2024, it was just a repeat of 2016, a rejection of objective reality and force feeding a narrative that a growing number of people can see through and reject. So until they start putting forth a platform that's not based around identity politics or trying to manipulate people and coming up with real, tangible ideas and a platform that people can see a path to real change economically, we're just going to be forced into two bad decisions on election day. This is going to cause a lot of discomfort among party leadership because number one, you're going to have to start supporting policies that are not big business friendly. And those big business donors are going to start cutting fewer checks, which might not be all that bad, considering that the Democrats outspent Trump in pretty much the last three campaigns. If he was able to win with a lower budget, maybe Democrats can do the same. Maybe they don't always have to bend over for big business. Maybe they should look back to the 2016 primary and look at what Bernie Sanders was saying, try to understand why he had such enthusiasm behind him. And a lot of the things that he was talking about in 2016, especially on immigration and wealth inequality and the reasons for that, those things might hurt some people's feelings and it might change the narrative. If you're somebody who traffics in ideas and you work for an NGO and you donate to the Democrats and try to influence policy, you don't want to hear about reducing immigration to fix income inequality. You want to open borders. So does big business. Interests converge. You want it for sociological reasons. They want it for economic reasons. The rest of the country probably wants it for economic reasons. So I'm going to leave it here. I hope I've given you something to ruminate on. I want you to let me know in the comments what you think the DNC autopsy actually said. What was so embarrassing in there that they don't want it released? And what direction you think the Democratic Party should be headed in, whether you're a Republican or Democrat, because I think it's important that we have two healthy parties. If we only have two of them, they should at least be putting forth good ideas. And if you're a Republican, you should care about having a Democratic Party that is not out of their fucking mind. We should move toward an era where our choice is between two good choices instead of the lesser of two evils. So don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments.